Welcome to another episode of Great Moments in Orchestral History here at the very end of 2018. It's been hopefully a good year for all of you. Usually I have a score opposite me of the music that I've conducted and that I'm going to be talking about. Maybe it's just one more physical incarnation of the music itself and to represent what I work with. All we have is another mug over there. Someone even asked me what it is that I drink out of these with really no idea as to what it might be, but it's just a mug of water. And we have another one over there because representing today's piece is the composer. Welcome, Eliza Brown. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers.
Cheers.
It's very hydrating.
Oh yeah, it's good water.
Now, is it fair to say that you are maybe the most representative representation of your music, even maybe more so than this little score of ink and paper that I look at? Or certainly
That's a
seems
fascinating
like
question.
Yeah.
We could get into long debates about whether the music that composers write is really an expression of self, or if it's a sort of constructed performance of self, or if it's something different altogether. So I'm not sure how to answer that question in a simple way.
Let me check with the network and our sponsors to see how much time we have today.
Ask an academic a question, get an academic answer.
So the piece of music that we're going to be looking at today is Eliza Brown's composition Filaments for solo violinist and a chamber orchestra. I guess it is a full orchestra, but not necessarily all of the instruments are included. Partly because, as there often is with a new composition, there's just certain conditions that were sort of optimal to making the piece happen. So that sort of negotiated with your preferences for the piece of music, and we ended up with an ensemble of a certain size, which often happens these days with new compositions. The question I want to ask is, I just described a piece of music by a wonderful living composer, Eliza Brown, but in the past I've noticed that I've only talked about composers that have already perished. And for the most part, I can talk about those composers only using their last name. Mm-hmm. And nowadays, we are blessed with some living composers, such as Sarajevo, Chernovin, Gusty in Chicago, and others who might only be recognized by their last name. Do you ever feel like that you could be recognized just by one name? Like, for example, if you had a name that was maybe as attention-getting as Wild, would the Wild composer? How do you feel like your name represents you as an artist?
Well, I certainly don't think that I should go on a campaign of trying to be known as Brown for a number of reasons. Mm-hmm. So my initials, or my first initial is E, and then my last name is Brown, and there's another composer who already came before me who was Earl Brown, who was an American composer in the mid-20th century, and I think E. Brown and E. Brown, Earl Brown and myself, might have a little competition there for who gets to just be Brown or E. Brown. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not very attached to my name as a representation of myself as an artist.
Is there anything that you do feel like is as physical or a literate representation of your art more than anything else, or is it just not matter so much?
No, I mean, I don't even know how to answer that question. Are you asking about scores?
Oh, or anything.
Yeah, I mean, scores communicate something about a piece and what you hope it will be like. At least for me, I think for my work, the score is not the piece. There might be some composers that feel like making the score is sort of the work that they do, and then beyond that, it's out of their hands, that sort of the making of the piece beyond that artifact is sort of someone else's arena of authorship.
Well, and that can be why it's so amazing to have the composer, as we did, to work with, and not only receiving the music, but rehearsing it and performing it, because we're able to talk directly to the source of the music. And really, there's no question as to what is authoritative, unless you choose to.
Yeah, I have issues with authority, my own and other people's. So I prefer to think of it as collaboration than authority, because sometimes performers have really great ideas about what the things I've written on paper mean, and so we really work together to make the sort of thing that you hear, the sounding object that is the piece, out of whatever it is that I've put on the page. And there are times, it really goes both ways. There are times when, you know, I'm saying, hey, I think what I wrote is a little different than what you're doing, please do what I wrote. And there are times when I'm hearing what I wrote and going, you know what, that's not it, and the instinct you have is better than what I put. So I really think it's collaborative. And actually, to go back to your other question, the best representation of my music, I think, would just be to be at a live performance of it. I think that my music really kind of exists in its most optimal conditions in live performance, because it often has very quiet little sounds in there, and there's often very subtle communication among performers, and I really value the sense of community and collaboration that comes from live performance and from the rehearsal process. So yeah, I think that any live performance is probably the most representative thing about my work for me. And of course that's interesting because it's very ephemeral, right? You can't ever get a live performance back.
So you talked about the fact that the music doesn't necessarily always dictate what should happen or what could happen in a certain context, musically speaking, with live performance or whatnot. And I don't think that that's actually just something that you're allowing, or that is maybe a weakness of the printed notation, because there's so much music that we perform where there is a history of doing things that aren't written in the music. Like if you look at a composer like Beethoven or Mozart that we've already talked about in earlier episodes, we see generally the rhythm, the pitch of the music, and they'll give us like a dynamic like piano or forte, but there's a lot more subtle nuances that are traditionally done in that music that we learn about through studying performances, by reading things about the performance, by being taught by people who've done it before us and in previous performances. So I don't know, maybe is there sort of a practice, or could there be a practice to people performing your music in sort of a similar way, or people performing music of this time?
So I think the answer is obviously yes, but like yes plus. There's, you know, every composer has idiosyncrasies in the way they put music onto the page that performers have to navigate when they need to make decisions about, okay, I'm seeing this collection of symbols, what sounds do I make in response to this collection of symbols or images? And so for any given composer, performers could develop kind of an understanding of how that composer's notation works or what idiosyncrasies it has, and develop an understanding of how that composer likes their work to sound, or how that notation particularly suggests certain interpretations. And I think it's really important what you said, that this isn't exclusive to contemporary composers who are working now, although I think there's been a proliferation of idiosyncratic notation practices in composition since, let's say, maybe 1950.
Let's assume that right here now we're showing examples of idiosyncratic scores.
several centuries to develop music notation that had even the degree of specificity that you might expect to see at a typical piano lesson today.
Mm-hmm. Which allows people, other than those who are most immediate to you, to perform your music. Because if you're monks singing essentially for yourselves and for God at a church, you don't necessarily need to have another abbey full of folks be able to perform the same chant music halfway around the world, because you're doing something that's very personal and the music is actually in service to something else. But nowadays, I mean, people that all around the world have been able to perform your music, mm-hmm. probably oftentimes without your presence.
Yeah.
What's that like?
I have this thing that I tell myself sometimes, which is that my music travels better than I do. So like my music has been to South America. I haven't. So take me next time, music. So yeah, and I think that's great. And I think, you know, with notation, it's sort of a matter of like, well, what are you trying to communicate? If you're trying to communicate this really exact sonic vision that you'd like someone else to replicate exactly, then you're gonna write your music down in a certain way with lots of detail. And in terms of the particular piece that we're presenting here today, the notation is fairly specific, but it's a little bit devious in that the piece is so slow that there's just a lot of time, especially for the soloist, when the soloist is playing very long notes, where even if I've said, okay, do a crescendo, get a little louder on this one really long note, well, you might have 6 seconds of that long note, and how quickly do you get loud within that time? How loud do you get? Do you do it all in sort of a linear manner, or is it more of an exponential curve? There's a lot of decisions that the soloist can make. So I tend to think about my music in both of those ways, that sometimes I'm communicating specific sounds I'd like anyone to be able to replicate, or sometimes I'm communicating like, please do this set of activities together, and there's a range of sonic outcomes that are what I want. There's not just one thing that I want. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I want people to do things together and for sound to result.
I think that's one also reason why it was wonderful for the group of university students that I was able to work with at Andrews University, and for our wonderful soloist Carla Trinchik, violinist, because in ways your piece challenges musicians to perform it to its fullest potential, but it doesn't really challenge musicians in the way that they're usually challenged. So for myself, programming a particular concert that I programmed, there were pieces that challenged myself and the musicians in ways that are more traditional in terms of technique, endurance, some forms of interpretation and other things as well. But I appreciate that your piece challenges folks in a different way. And I think that has some relationship to the notation as well, where we could make discoveries in terms of what kinds of sounds to make that were not necessarily explicit in terms of how we usually look at and decode the music that we see.
Yeah, and that makes me think of, I think one of my favorite moments in the rehearsal that we did with the Andrews University Orchestra was when there's these little tremolos that the strings do in the beginning of the piece, and they don't last very long, and they're very quiet, and they're sort of static in pitch. They're sort of the same pitches, you know, multiple times. And
let's actually just, sorry to interrupt, let's listen to just one very quick thing. this example of when you actually made a suggestion or a request of the musicians, this wasn't a situation where there was any mistake whatsoever being made.
Exactly, yeah, no, they were...
There were some other instances.
They were playing well. It was just a question of hitting on the right interpretation of the symbols that were there that would make all the material of the piece sort of lock into itself.
Mm-hmm. Folks are lucky because I spare them from mediocre moments in orchestral history.
Such as?
They will not be named. Only the great ones here. So that moves me to often speak about why, in my opinion, the particular instance that we're talking about happens to be a great moment in orchestral history. And folks could say that anytime you have a composer in the house, be it a brand new piece or a relatively new piece, that is something great. And I agree with that it's a wonderful experience for the audience and for the musicians to all have some kind of interaction with a composer. But I think that's a little bit too easy of a statement for our purposes, because for a great moment our standards are pretty high, right? up there somewhere, maybe in outer space. What I love about this piece is, well, to back up, I think that in the orchestral world, in the classical music world, we're often challenged to demonstrate why what we do is relevant to modern society, to culture, to whatever comparison can be made. So we're often performing Star Wars in the concert hall. We're creating a wonderful fun moment for people at a holiday concert, etc., etc. And I think that's worthwhile and important for the orchestra to be able to relate to folks in obvious ways. But although it's important for the orchestra to relate to folks in more obvious and exciting or maybe even entertaining ways, I think it's fine for the orchestra to offer people an experience that they don't often have. We live in a world that people will often say is very busy, is loud, can be impersonal, or personal through the medium of the internet or through the phone. So I think it's very important for the orchestra to be able to often, or at least occasionally, find opportunities to demonstrate to people other experiences and how those other experiences could be appreciated, how they can be relevant or important or at least appreciated by folks, and those could be a variety of other experiences. But that brings me to some of the things I appreciate about Eliza's Filaments. Number one being that for the listener, it's going to, in my opinion, it's going to slow things down for them. It's going to be mostly quiet. It's going to make possible a space in which reflection and careful listening are possible. And another thing that I think that it does that is particularly unique, at least in the musical world, is that it makes sound thematic. Or another way of saying that is that oftentimes the content that you might focus on in a piece of music might be like a melody, for example, or something else that might be familiar or repetitive in a certain way. And I think that in Eliza's piece, and this piece in particular, that sort of content that comes to the forefront or might be recognizable or repetitive or adjusted in certain ways is actually just sound or texture itself. And one thing that I thought of that could be a comparison is that sometimes artists have done this. A comparison could be a painter making paint be sort of the subject of a painting, for example. So maybe I have a few examples of those here. Would you agree with that? Is that important to you? How do you see this piece or your music offering some sort of a contrast or whatever?
Yeah, I think that I totally agree with you about the idea of sort of making sound kind of a foreground element of the music. I think that one thing that my music has tended to do throughout my whole life as a composer is to not do that exclusively, but to foreground sound in contexts where aspects of traditional melody are still present. So sometimes there will sort of be a dance between whether, these sort of more abstract areas of composition are foreground or more traditional aspects of composition are foreground. And I didn't set out to write music that walks that line because I wanted to make it more familiar for people who listen to historical classical music, but that has been a result of that tendency that I have as a composer to combine those ways of thinking about material and composition.
Why do you think that's developed that way? Does that reflect things that you like in other music, or is it just intuitive? Or
I think it reflects things that I like. I mean, I really like Baroque music, and I'm a counterpoint nerd, and so there are sort of aspects of music history that I've spent some time studying and care about, and definitely make their way into my music. But I also just I like listening to the hum of machines. That is beautiful to me. So if I can write music that sort of combines, if those are sort of two ends of a spectrum, my pieces tend to sort of move fluidly around that spectrum, and sometimes we might be at both ends at the same time somehow. So it's been something I'm aware of, that I think my music often feels accessible to people who both like sort of noisier things and who like traditional classical music, because there's a little bit of both of those elements in there.
Since we have a wonderful production team here at Great Moments in Orchestral History, we could play an example of some beautiful machine humming for the viewers. Do you have a suggestion of any particularly beautiful machine hum that?
Beautiful machine hum. Well, there's an entire building. We're here in Greencastle, Indiana, right very close to the campus of DePaul University, where I teach, and there's an entire building that hums quite loudly over by our nature park, and you can hear its reverberations for quite literally a couple of miles because of how the land is shaped. So that's a good one.
So there is a particularly striking moment in Eliza's piece. It seems, within the context of the piece, like it makes sense, even though it's surprising and out of character, just because it's effective. Why does that moment exist in the piece, or does it need to have a reason for existing?
Well, I don't think it needs to have a reason for existing other than it sounds good to have it there. If I were talking to a student who was like, I can't justify this decision I just made, I would be like, if you think it sounds good, you have justified your decision. But in this case, I did have more of a reason for that moment. And it comes from this Virginia Woolf quotation that the whole piece kind of emanates from. And so I'm going to read that. So this is from Virginia Woolf's novel, The Waves. Yes. So it is. Anyhow, I heard voices, a sob on the stair late at night. It is the end of their relationship. Thus we spin round us infinitely fine filaments and construct a system. And so it's this really short quote, and it's got 3 sentences. So there's, anyhow, I heard voices, a sob on the stair late at night. So someone is receiving like partial information about a social situation. Sentence 2, it is the end of their relationship. So someone is interpreting quite a lot of very specific implication into the partial information they have just received. Then finally, thus we spin round us infinitely fine filaments and construct a system. So that's the meta-commentary on what has just happened, that with this very small amount of information, someone has intuited the meaning of that information is like a huge life event for the people they imagine are involved. There's not even confirmation of who this is talking about. And so I find that really powerful, because I think that it speaks to me about things that people do. People make stories out of the limited information that they have access to, and that's how we understand the world. That's like how I see humanity, that we are beings that construct stories and impart meaning to partial information to like make us be able to get through the day.
Yes, we are burdened with consciousness.
Yes, but consciousness that can't perceive everything.
Yes.
And can't put it all together into an adequate, like we can never possibly put all of the potential filaments of information together into a complete understanding, but we're always grasping for that. So to me, this is like 3 sentences that sort of sum up the human condition. And I don't think I tried to write a piece that sums up the human condition. I'm glad I didn't try to do that. That would have been too much. But I wanted to at least reflect on those lines. And so the moment that he just mentioned is the moment that for me is the interpretation, is the moment when the person sort of puts everything together and says it is the end of their relationship. This is sort of a death knell to the relationship, whatever that was and whoever was involved.
Can we listen to that?
Absolutely. For me, is a very musical author, that she's thinking about the timing and the pacing of her sentences and paragraphs the way that a composer might be thinking about structuring time. The waves implies, some kind of regular cyclic motion, and the book really reads that way. There's sort of a series of events that have sort of build up and a crest and a moment where everything sort of comes together in a denouement, and so musically the piece does that too. So the piece sort of operates in waves on various different time scales.
Have you written other pieces inspired by Woolf in some capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the first time I ever tried to write an opera of any kind was at summer camp when I was 15. And I wrote one scene from Mrs. Dalloway as a standalone operatic scene just to try it. I find that music pretty hilarious now.
This wasn't like dodgeball summer camp, right?
No, this was composer summer camp. It's called the Walden School Young Musicians Program. And if you know anyone ages 9 through 18 who wants to go to composer camp, look us up.
Anytime you have a guest on the talk show, they have to be able to plug what they're working. I should be plugging. I can attest to the Walden School, yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. But that reminds me that earlier you were talking about sort of why is it relevant for orchestras to work with composers and to do new music. And when you were talking about that, I was thinking about two words that I often bring up with my students around new music and composing, and those words are possibility and permission. That's one reason I think that new music is important, is that new music is all about this sense of possibility, that you could experience something that no one has experienced before that is incredibly profound or incredibly fun or incredibly some adjective that you don't have available to you because it's describing an experience you've never had. And I think that's true for those of us that make the music, that that's one reason we do it, is for that possibility. There could be something around the corner that is so worth it. And that for the listener, that's also true. I don't like every piece of new music that I hear, but I'm happy to hear some that I don't like, because there always is the possibility that the one I like is going to be the next one that I listen to. Mm-hmm. So I think that's important. I think that's something that can sort of motivate one as either a maker of music or a listener, an audience member of music, is that sense of possibility, and then also the sense of permission, that expressing oneself artistically is a really important thing for people to do, whether they do that professionally or for themselves. I hope that that's something that everyone has access to, and I want people to feel a sense of permission to do that in whatever way speaks to them. And so I think that's one of the other really nice things, ideally, about new music, is that it can sort of offer this world of permission. I think good teaching in new music gives people permission to try new things, to try expressing themselves in new ways that will maybe sort of get them closer to something that feels personal and meaningful to them. And that for listeners, it's like they have permission to find something and take it for what it is, and love it or hate it, accept it, reject it, think about it, find meaning in it. There's no one right meaning to find. You have permission to hear whatever you hear in any piece of new music, because there's always the possibility that if you exercise that agency that you have as a listener, that you're going to have that profound experience that you didn't know you were going to have that day.
So many thanks to Eliza for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. And I also want to take this time to thank the Andrews University Orchestra and Carla, the violin soloist, for her wonderful performance and their wonderful performance.
Yeah, you should be able to find the full performance at the link below.